They rerouted their stormwater straight onto my land. No knock, no notice, no, sorry about that. Just a concrete pipe shoved through the retaining wall and a little civilization's idea of convenience pouring down into my pasture. I stood in ankle-deep muck and thought, well, one of us is about to learn an expensive lesson, and it sure as hell wasn't going to be me. You want to hear how a small town, a new subdivision, and a stubborn old man ended up in a water fight? Pull up a seat because this one's got a barn, a backhoe, and the kind of petty satisfaction that ages like bourbon. I live just outside a little town in western Kentucky, the sort of place where folks still tip a hand as they pass on the two-lane road where things are slower and where property means something more than a mortgage payment. 15 years ago, I bought this place when I could finally afford something solid, a red barn that needed more elbow grease than cash rolling pasture and room for a couple of horses. I worked construction in Louisville for years, saved whatever I could, and when my dad passed, I used the money to buy land that didn't argue back. That was the point, a place that keeps its word. The lower pasture has always been the wet part of the property, sure, but it drained. We get big spring rains that rattle the tin roof, and by the next day the ground is forgiving again. Walt, my neighbor, pushing 70 and full of stories about when this was all tobacco, used to say the land was smarter than half the people he'd met. It knows how to drink and when to let go. So when that week of rain hit last April, I wasn't sweating it at first. Gray skies, steady pour, creek swelling, but behaving the kind of storm you watch with a cup of coffee and no real worry. By the sixth morning, though, the air smelled swampy, thick, and sour, and my boots sank deeper than they should have. I walked the fence line and found half my field under a nasty sheet of standing water, not puddles, but a wide, ugly spread that had plastic wrappers and cigarette butts swirling in it, an oily sheen catching the weak light. The grass where the horses grazed was flattened and yellowing, and water was pushing right up against the side of the barn, not flooded yet, but close enough to make me imagine feed bags swollen with mold hardware, warped months of work ruined. I stood there, hands on hips, listening to the drip off the eaves, thinking this wasn't natural. So I walked the back edge of my property to the retaining wall that separates me from the subdivision on the Briar Ridge Estates, with its brick entrance and perfect lawns. About halfway down the wall, I saw a pale concrete circle cut clean through the stone. Fresh. Too fresh. A pipe a foot sticking out, angled down toward my pasture, with a little canyon dug under it where the flow had carved its path. I crouched and saw the debris caught around it, and suddenly all the bulldozers and scraped hillside from when Phase 2 went in clicked into place. They'd built a retention pond up there, and instead of handling the runoff themselves, someone decided gravity ought to take care of it. And gravity led straight to me. I felt that slow heat, not the wild red rage, but the steady build you get when you realize you've been chosen as a cheap solution. I took pictures, video timestamps, the pipe, the waterway, the oily sheen, the flattened grass, then called the property manager, a guy named Trent. I'd met once at a county meeting. Slick hair, pressed shirt, the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. He answered smooth, said it was part of an updated drainage plan. When I asked if they'd gotten permission or an easement, there was a pause, then the shrug through the line, we didn't need one. Your property sits at the lowest elevation, he said. It's natural drainage. Natural drainage. I laughed because a 12-inch concrete pipe blasting thousands of gallons into someone else's field doesn't sound natural. It sounded calculated. I hung up before I said something I'd regret and stared at the pasture, feeling that night as if every raindrop on my roof were a tiny letter telling me what they'd done. I went to the county planning office the next morning with printed photos, a little map, and the kind of polite stubbornness that's mostly patience and a bad temper. Denise at the counter took my complaint, said an inspector would be assigned, and told me it could be a few weeks. A few weeks, I thought my horses would be eating algae by then. Walt came by chewing a toothpick, and when he saw the pipe, he spat into the mud. They do that without asking, he said. Sure did, I said. That old sideways look he gave me, you gonna let it stand, hung with me. Here's the thing about me, I'm not a hothead. I don't pick fights for sport. But I believe in lines, literal ones like fences and deeds, and invisible ones like respect. You cross either without permission, there ought to be consequences. I called Trent back, kept my voice steady. County shows no record of permits tied to my parcel, I told him. You installed a pipe that redirects runoff onto my land. That's damage. It's water, he said, voice clipped, and it's within code. Engineering for who, I asked. He hemmed and hawed about homeowners and proper drainage for the subdivision. The quiet hierarchy was obvious: dozens who pay HOA dues versus one guy with a barn and horses. He offered to monitor the situation. Define excessive, I asked. If my barn has structural damage and feed ruined, will that qualify? He didn't answer before hanging up. That silence told me plenty. That night I pulled my deed across the kitchen table and read every line. No easements granted to Briar Ridge, no shared drainage agreements. Then I read about water law in Kentucky and found the common enemy doctrine tucked in there like a promise: landowners can protect themselves from surface water and are not obligated to serve as a discharge area for someone else's engineered runoff. As long as you don't act maliciously or negligently, you can defend your land. That phrase lodged in me. I didn't have to accept their concentrated water, and I sure as hell wasn't going to be a swamp for their convenience. So I called for heavy clay dirt, not the sandy stuff that washes, and I called Walt for his backhoe. By Friday afternoon, we had truckloads dumped along the inside of my fence, and Walt swinging that backhoe like he'd found youth in the gears. We built a berm about 2 feet high and thick at the base, sloping it back onto my property so it wouldn't collapse. At the pipe mouth, I laid down a heavy plastic liner and stacked cinder blocks tight in a half circle, pressing them into the packed clay so there were no gaps. I didn't climb their wall. I didn't touch the pipe beyond my fence. I simply removed the low spot on my land where their water had been exiting. If water came through now, it would hit a packed earth spine and have nowhere to go but back up the pipe. For 2 days, nothing happened. The pasture began to breathe again. Then Sunday, the sky went dark and heavy, that kind of rain you feel in your bones before it starts. I put the horses up near the barn and watched from the porch as the rain built. The pipe gushed, hit the berm, and at first just puddled. Then the level built, and instead of crossing my field, it pressed against the retaining wall. There's a strange calm when you've done everything within your rights and the rest is physics. I sat and listened. Around midnight, there were lights on the ridge, flashlights, SUV headlights, and the distant whine of pumps kicking on. By morning, the pond up top had swollen far beyond its banks. A walking trail was underwater, and 3 houses had sump pumps running like they'd found a new summer job. That confirmation wasn't joy. It was confirmation. Gravity hadn't changed. The only thing that had was where the water was allowed to go. Trent arrived at my gate like a man who'd just discovered real ground and didn't like the texture. He marched up my driveway, hair-plastered loafers in the gravel, and demanded to know what I'd done. "You obstructed the drainage outlet," he barked. I told him I'd built a berm on my property to keep their water from carving my barn's foundation. He said I'd caused damage. I told him their design had directed concentrated runoff onto my land without permission. I mentioned lawns and HOA dues. You could see the thing shift in his face, not because I'd convinced him, but because I'd spoken the truth out loud. More board members showed up, including Patricia, the mailbox color enforcer, lecturing that my actions affected the community. I told her their actions affected me first. I told them they were welcome to seek emergency court orders and injunctions, but what they didn't know was that Denise at the county had flagged my complaint urgent after seeing photos and hearing about the flooding. By noon, a county truck pulled in, and a neutral inspector named Greg took measurements and photos. He asked Trent for permit numbers. There was a pause, the kind that stretches long enough to become meaningful. Trent stumbled over paperwork. The inspector said the installation appeared to be completed without proper authorization, and that redirecting concentrated stormwater onto a neighboring parcel without easement was a violation. Silence dropped like a lid. Within 48 hours, emergency pumps were lowering the pond, and the HOA scrambled contractors to temporarily reroute water internally. Word went through the subdivision fast. Some homeowners blamed me, some blamed the board for cutting corners. A week later, a man from one of the flooded homes came to my porch, tired and confused. He asked if I had to block it, and I told him honestly I asked them to fix it. They told me it was standard, that my property was the natural low point. He looked at the pasture, mostly dry now, and rubbed his forehead. "My kids' playroom flooded," he said. I said I was sorry, but they made that choice without asking either of us. In the end, Briar Ridge spent close to $200,000 redesigning their drainage underground piping, rerouted reinforced basins, added the concrete pipe, removed the hole in the wall, sealed as if it had never been there. My berm stayed not out of spite, but as a reminder that boundaries matter. By midsummer, the pasture was green again, horses back to their favorite spots, barn dry through 2 more storms. The thing that changed in me, though, wasn't how much land I owned. It was what I believed about people. I used to think conversation fixed most things. Sometimes it does. Other times you need consequence. I don't wake up wishing their tennis courts crumble or their lawns die. I don't hope for misfortune. Karma isn't my job. What I do believe is respect for boundaries isn't optional, not in land and not in life. They looked at a map, saw a lower patch of earth, and decided it was cheaper to pile their problem on top of me because I wasn't behind a brick sign and HOA bylaws. Maybe some people would have swallowed it, called a lawyer later, and taken the hit. Maybe some people would have mowed, smiled, and let their pasture become a pond. I didn't. So tell me, if someone rerouted their problem onto your land, would you quietly accept it because it was easier? Or would you put the ground back where it belongs and let gravity sort out the rest? Was I protecting what was mine? Or did I go too far? Drop your thoughts. Tell me your story. I read every comment. And if you've ever tangled with a neighbor, a board, or anyone who treated your boundaries like a suggestion, share this with them. Sometimes the line between right and wrong isn't written in ink. Sometimes it's built with a backhoe, some clay, and the stubborn belief that your land and your life are yours to defend.